Okay, welcome to the 59th lecture of the Otaru University of Commerce English Lecture Series. Today our speaker is Mr. Fred MacCallum. He worked for more than 30 years at General Motors, and he is here today to talk to us about that experience. And the title of his topic is Too Big to Fail. Please welcome Mr. Fred MacCallum.
Thank you so much, John. I was really looking forward to this event. And perfect timing, the spring weather is here already. And what a nice change from winter. Again, my name is Fred MacCallum. And I don't know if you recognize the accent, but I'm a Canadian. And I grew up in the Toronto area, Great Lakes area. So going back in time, at the turn of the century, the largest carriage maker and sleigh maker in the world was McLaughlin Carriage Company. So as business moved away from the horse-drawn carriage to automobiles, Mr. Sam McLaughlin, an immigrant from Scotland, decided to import engines and axles and other parts from Buick Motor Company in Michigan. And then he created a car. This was called the Buick McLaughlin. And right up to the Second World War, the GM division was called McLaughlin Motors. So cars were labeled McLaughlin, Buicks, and so on. He managed to maintain a lot of autonomy from the GM. And GM Canada was the home to the Camaro. It was produced in Quebec for a long time, and now it's produced in Oshawa, Ontario. So I hope some of you will recognize this brand. Any of you watched the Hawaii 5-0 series? Okay, well, yeah, they feature the GM Camaro as a fast and powerful car for the Hawaii 5-0 team. Again, I come from Ontario. Ontario is this big patch of land. Over in our neighbors here is Michigan, Detroit, Michigan. Oh, sorry, Michigan here. Then we go over to Illinois, Chicago. So Detroit, Lansing, Highway 75 is all automotive. And then there's a 401 through here that takes the trucks back and forth through the parts industry over to more automotive, Buffalo, New York, and so on. So Michigan, Ohio, Ontario are the chief traditional automotive producing areas. Of course, automotive production in North America is now moving south to places like Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi. Toronto is much like Los Angeles. Shawn was saying he was recently in Los Angeles. We're on a par with Los Angeles with huge roads. So this is the main road going through Toronto. I think it's 16 lanes of highway. And that's the main road. Another 10 miles north is another big highway. And Toronto is home to the Toronto Blue Jays, if any of you are a sports fan. Are you okay? I picked up the title Too Big to Fail. The origin in Canada was back in 1992. There was the government of Ontario was headed by Bob Rae, and the General Motors leaders went to him and said, "Oh, we're a little short on cash. Can we just stop contributing to our pension fund?" And that was an exception to the law. And they said, "Don't worry, we're so big, we'll never fail." And he signed away the General Motors obligation to top up their pension on the idea of too big to fail. So that hit the press. All the headlines in the newspapers were General Motors too big to fail. Canada's leading manufacturing company. That was way back in 1992. But little did they know that GM was on the road to bankruptcy. So talking about credibility, as Shawn mentioned, I worked from high school. I started out as a co-op student. So I spent 6 weeks in Ontario working in GM factories and 6 weeks in Michigan at the General Motors Institute, their own university. For 5 years I went back and forth. And through that experience I had a very broad range of experiences inside General Motors, and I had a chance to meet General Motors trainees from all over the world. But to maybe expand my background, as I prepared this presentation, I picked up some really important books. This book by Michelle Maynard, she's a woman, and she's based in Michigan. The unique perspective she had is she knew the leaders' wives. So she got an inside track of what was going on in General Motors through the wives. And this is a very informative book about, as you see the break line here, this man was leading General Motors in a very traditional way. He was like very distant from the world, saying, oh, General Motors, they get one more great hit and everything will be fine again. Well, the board of directors didn't think so. So the board of directors initiated a coup. There was an internal revolution in General Motors, and this younger man, Jack Smith, took over. He was more in tune with the times, so to speak. So this book talks about an internal revolution that happened around 1992 era, which is very good. This book I'm not very pleased, but this is a renowned Fortune magazine reporter, Alex Taylor. For years and years, Alex Taylor has written about the auto industry, in particular General Motors. When you read his book, you can definitely see he's an outsider. He comments on the character of the General Motors leaders. And there were a lot of the leaders of General Motors were a bit like emperors. They lived inside their palace, divorced from the real world, and they acted in funny ways. Now where I come in is I was in the General Motors Japan office for a long time, and the reason I was put in Tokyo for almost 8 years was to get all the details on the competitors. Because there was little known in General Motors what Toyota and these other companies were doing. It was a great mystery to the leaders. Even though they were already on the way to eat our breakfast, lunch, and soon dinner too. So when I was in Tokyo, I remember Lloyd Royce, leader of General Motors, came. He flew into Narita, and of course he couldn't take a taxi to downtown Tokyo. He took a helicopter, and we had to pack his snacks in a little cooler for his helicopter ride. So we had to get some of his favorite nuts and colas from American sources. And that's how the emperors of General Motors operated. Now I met him, Roger Smith, who is, in some people's opinion, the guy who really trashed GM. His actions really created chaos for many years. The first time I met him, he was in Japan to meet bankers and get a few loans to keep the thing going. The second time he came with his wife to speak at a conference in Kyoto. So I had to go to the Nagoya airport and talk to the airport manager about getting a good parking spot for his private jet coming in from the United States, and also make sure that the VIP room was up to his standards, because his wife would be there unattended for some time while he met other auto leaders. So I went to the airport, took pictures, and got layouts and made sure he wouldn't be walking too far as he came off the tarmac. The most informative and realistic book that I found, this is by Bob Lutz. Bob Lutz basically worked for every car company in the world. He's 87 years old. After he retired from Ford, Chrysler, and Excite Battery, he was asked by General Motors to come back and lead product programs. And he's written 3 books after he retired from General Motors. And so this book Bob Lutz's Car Guys versus Bean Counters is very informative, and he speaks his mind as well. He was asked first to be a consultant to General Motors, and he said, no way, I want to have some power to change things. So he became vice chairman, and he tried to correct some of the problems of General Motors before the bankruptcy. And he was around when he finally went bankrupt. So he served under 4 CEOs, and in his book he comments on some of that. So of course my personal experience, I started out in GM Canada. I came to Japan to go to Sophia University to take a master's degree. And during my master's degree studies, I visited Honda, Toyota, and many other major makers and got an inside view. And then I came back to Canada, and they wanted me to be a supervisor on an engine assembly line. But on the side, Detroit kept phoning to ask about this strange guy that went to Japan. So they finally said, you can't go to Detroit. You're a supervisor, very low level peon in the huge hierarchy of General Motors, but you can make a slideshow and send it to Detroit. So I sent a slideshow to Detroit talking about the state of the Japanese auto industry, and it eventually became a film, internally produced film that went to hundreds of locations. And through that film, I was asked by the GM Technical Center to start working for them. And they said, the only way we're going to figure out what's going on in Japan is to send you there and leave you there. So in 1981, I came to Japan for 8 years to study our competitors and send back reports to GM. This is the era before the internet. To actually get information, you had to go to the National Diet Library or meet people person to person, or access the company journals, engineering journals, and what have you. Then after the technical center contracted and cut employees like crazy, so in 1990 I went to Germany. From Germany I went to Switzerland, the headquarters of GM Europe, and then I went over to England. So I'll talk more about that career as we go through the slides, because I have 36 slides and only 60 minutes, so I gotta get going. Here, 1974, I joined GM. And GM, because of there was the war, in Arab-Israeli war, and the oil embargo, suddenly gas prices went up by 4 times in the United States. So there was a sudden need for small cars, and we can say General Motors failed because it didn't have small cars, but in fact it had lots of small cars. They had the Corvair was the first, it was a kind of a version of the Volkswagen, engine in the rear. They brought the old German car to America. This was a top seller called the Chevette, very popular. They sold 300,000 per year of the Chevette. They couldn't make enough of them. Before the Chevette, they had the Vega. And characteristic of first it was the Corvair and then the Vega, and then this is very characteristic of the American personality. They said, we're not going to copy small cars from the rest of the world, we're going to leapfrog them and have something technically that's beyond everybody else. So this one, Ralph Nader made a big fanfare of this, and it was unsafe, basically. It crashed when the problem with the heavy engine in the back is if you lose control of the steering, it starts spinning around. And this one, they decided to have a special aluminum engine. And when I joined General Motors, most of my colleagues were test driving these cars on the highway for durability because the engines didn't last. But here comes the Japanese cars. They were known for trouble-free motoring, and people couldn't get enough of them in 1974. So this was kind of the start of the end. Bob Lutz mentions General Motors was traditionally an old-fashioned car maker. They had the big frame, engine in the front, and this is a drive system going to the back. So if you've ever been in an old car, there's a big tunnel in the middle that takes up space. All of GM's cars were like this, and trucks. But the latest technology was front-wheel drive, and this was 1959, as it's the Mini Cooper. So everything, the transmission is up front and leaving lots of space for people and cargo. The leader of General Motors said, oh, there's our answer. This is Roger Smith. He was always going in extremes. He said, get rid of all of these kind of cars and go to this car. And then we can win the race. We'll leapfrog them. Well, that was like an overload for the whole engineering community, all the factories, and of course finance, to make such a radical conversion. And so I bought one of these first front-wheel drive cars, a Chevrolet Citation, and it was renowned for problems. It wasn't quite refined when it got out there on the marketplace, all that radical change. But it was a good car, but it was still heavier than the Toyotas at that era. So the Toyotas still, and the Nissans, they were economical. You could go a lot further on a lightweight, and then Japanese car, plus they were more reliable. So here it is, just in recap. There was dramatic change triggered by the Arab oil embargo in 1974, and again in 1979, there were 2 oil embargoes. The price of gas went up. It seems cheap now, $1.90. Now it's $4 a gallon in America, but it was a radical change. Honda came to America and built a factory. There were all kinds of trade frictions between Japan and United States. And part of those negotiations, they said, well, 1985 was the doubling of the value of the yen, the Plaza Accord. So they tried to keep the Japanese out by increasing the value of their products, double the value of their products. The other game the American government said is, you have to come to America and make cars. You can't just import them. So Honda came and made cars in Ohio. And Toyota and GM joined up and made a joint venture in California. So the Corolla became a Chevrolet product. Here's Roger Smith shaking the hand of the Toyota family members, leaders, and then on a factory tour. This factory that General Motors basically gave the joint venture had the worst quality in the whole of North America, and a very bad reputation for the workers. They built pickup trucks and cars there. And GM had the parts division for General Motors was, of course, in the Midwest, Michigan, Ohio. They had what would typically happen is they would send shipments of parts to all the factories, and if there were too many defects in the parts, the factories would ship all the parts back. So the parts divisions of General Motors would know with a pretty high probability if they shipped the parts all the way to California, they probably wouldn't come back. So the rejected parts that came from the Midwest went to California. Hence the cars had a pretty bad reputation. Poor quality. As it turned out with Toyota management, it turned out the company had a better, higher quality and lower cost than any of the GM factories after a few years. It became the leader. And GM executives who were always flagged as high potential went out there for training under the Japanese. And after the bankruptcy in 2009, this joint venture was closed. The factory was empty, and Telsa, the electric car maker, now uses part of the California facility. So GM had trouble making its small cars, so part of its strategy was make alliance partners all over the world, especially in Asia. So they made it a partnership with Suzuki to make a Chevrolet. They made a partnership with Isuzu to make a Chevrolet truck. And the joint venture partnerships, the vehicles took too long to go from concept to sale. It was the era for modern before the modern computer networks. Some Asian makers, they got some Asian makers to make small cars and treated them like orphans or competitors. So it was a very tense relationship between these so-called alliance partners. It was a bit like a war alliance with your rivals. And I remember I was in Tokyo at that time, in the early 80s, and we brought in our first word processing computer. That was the Nintendo. This is maybe before many of you were born. We actually had to save the files on cassette tapes. You could maybe do 2 pages of word processing, and then you had to take it off the memory and put it onto a cassette disc. So it was an era of very slow movement of information, and we hard copied the reports that I made in Tokyo and sent them back to Detroit. So things have changed so much now with the internet, so much speed. And yeah, I spent 1981 to 1989 at the Tokyo office of General Motors. So just a little flashback to 1985. You could say this is the beginning of the big race. So here's Roger Smith. He's a typical leader of that era. He had spent all his life in the Treasury Department. He was a finance department graduate. These were very elite people who worked in the Wall Street Treasury Department. They knew all about money, but not that much about car making. So he did a lot of calculations, and he said, oh geez, we're losing money, let's diversify. Buy other businesses, get out of it. And then, much like you might do if the Titanic was sinking, you might rearrange the deck chairs. The Titanic's still sinking, but it gives you a good feeling if you rearrange the deck chairs. Maybe works off a bit of stress. So he decided to reorganize the whole of General Motors into 2 car groups and a truck group. So there were 3 parts he made. And I was part of CPC, which is the Canada, or Chevrolet Pontiac Canada. 160,000 employees, and we were competing directly with Toyota of 60,000, making 3.5 million vehicles. So already we're kind of a rough start to our little race here. We've got a few too many employees. And he spent a lot of money acquiring Hughes aircraft. He bought several companies and used billions of dollars, so they had to delay some product programs. So out comes our kind of stale donut cars. And people say, wow, that's a car you should have had a few years ago, but I don't want. So lo and behold, the CPC factories were not too busy in this era. After Japan, I went over to Europe, and I worked for Opel initially. It was a division of General Motors. And really it was the source of most of General Motors' small car making technology. And going back to 1990, that was the year the wall came down. The Soviet Union crumbled. West Germany took over East Germany. And Germany is a bit like Japan, very proud, industrial nation. And here's the Chancellor of Germany standing with the union leader at Opel. Because during the period of bankruptcy at General Motors was trying to sell Opel. And they came up with a deal with the Soviet bank and a Canadian parts maker. Obviously that didn't go through, because there's kind of a wartime relationship with Germany and Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union moved into East Germany, they just took all the machinery from the factories back to the Soviet Union. And there was a fear that they would take all of Opel's technology away. One technology Opel had was creating these modules. They would make modules outside the car and then place the modules into the car. So that saved a lot of time and effort building the car. So I spent time at the Opel facilities in Germany, and part of my job and role there was to introduce them to lean manufacturing, or the Toyota production system. And the book called The Machine That Changed the World was published in Germany in 1990. So the machine that changed the world was the MIT statistics, and they rated the productivity of car factories all over the world. So the Japanese were on top, least the number of people to make the most cars, then America, then Europe. So the Europeans were a little bit in disbelief. Why are we so ineffective? But when the wall came down, East Europeans were in fields on the weekend at the West German border, buying West German cars and throwing away their East German vehicles. So there was a huge auto boom in 1990, and when companies have good times, they see no need to change. So here I was, a change agent in Opel, and they said, well, we don't need to change. Look at all the cars we're selling. We're making more money than ever. Eastern Europe wants our cars. So I went from Germany to the GM Zurich headquarters, and in Zurich headquarters, the American leaders hired Japanese consultants. And so one headquarter person, one consultant, we were team members, and we went all over Europe to try to create change and make people aware of the need to rapidly change. And then finally I went into a car project at Vauxhall. But 1996, basically European laws were allowing more and more imports of Japanese cars, and the thing was falling apart as far as profitability, and they had to get rid of lots of employees. So off I went back to Canada. And 1996, bigger and bigger products were an era of irrational exuberance. This was the housing boom, low-cost loans for everything. Alan Greenspan in America just creating money for everybody to use. And people that built houses, plumbers, building contractors, wanted trucks, pickup trucks, SUVs, bigger the better. So GM was making record profits from selling the Suburban. The Suburban has a huge 5-6 liter V8 engines, and then they went one step further to create the Hummer, and it was just all a giant bubble, and then the whole thing collapsed when they had the mortgage crisis, the Lehman Brothers shock in 2008. But GM's finance division, the division that loaned people money to buy cars and loaned the dealer money to have inventory, GMAC was also engaged in subprime loans. They were making billions of dollars, and they were in fact financing. Their profits exceeded the losses made by the car divisions. So they kept GM going for about 5 or 6 years based on this scenario. So I have here's a guy going off the cliff. And Lehman Brothers was 2008. In 2006, GM was already trying to sell their subprime loan division of the finance company. They managed to unload it just in time. And later that company sued General Motors for unloading a bad deal. So that's a little bit of how I fit into the picture. I was in many locations around General Motors at the time. General Motors had, in my time overseas, they had 2 brushes with bankruptcy. The time that Roger Smith was in Japan looking for short-term loans from Japanese banks. When I was in Zurich, they were around the world looking for money to finance a little more, to get over cash flow problems. And then finally they did file for bankruptcy. Why did GM fail? Well, there was a lot of politics. GM was a lot like a government. The politics of compromise, so politicians always compromise with their constituents. In the case of General Motors, their constituents were governments, economies that would suffer if factories were closed. The union, of course, was a main constituent. Here's the union leader in the Senate in Washington, sitting beside the General Motors leader. This is the leader of Chrysler and the leader of Ford. They all flew to Washington. Any of you remember this event? They flew in their private jets to Washington, and the senators were so angry at them, they said, just get out, come back later, and drive or take a regular airline to Washington when you come to beg money. So they were seen in the public realm as very arrogant and out of touch, coming to Washington to get billions of dollars to keep them afloat. But luckily, Obama became president. He's a Republican, or no, he's a Democrat. So Democrat is very close with the unions. And he had to come up with some kind of compromise to save lots of union jobs. So he agreed with the bailout. Again, Richard Wagner came out of the finance department. Bob Lutz talks about him as he was maybe the most intelligent boss he had. He had a very high IQ. He could get a sense of everything, but as Bob Lutz mentions, GM probably had too many people with high IQs. They did lots of analysis of problems, but they never solved them. They were very aware of what was going on, and they had reams and reams of data and beautiful PowerPoint slides, but nothing got solved. And Bob Lutz is a kind of a gut feeling guy. He'd come in, say, yeah, it doesn't look right, it doesn't feel right, we're not going to do it. We're going to do something else. So of course, Richard Wagner was trying to argue with the senators using logic and numbers and saying, if General Motors goes down, the whole of America goes down. But in reality, both Canada and America have diversified their industries dramatically. There's 10 Toyota factories in America. That means there's 10 different constituencies that are not dependent on GM factories. And Ontario is much the same. They have a Honda, Toyota, some facilities from Mazda, and what have you. They don't have to depend on Chrysler, Ford, or General Motors anymore. And the politicians are well aware of that. Let's see, quick recap. We had, how are we doing on time? We're 30 minutes into this, we're halfway. So intense global competitions, the true global competition started in the 80s. GM small cars were based on national design. So another compromise that GM made is GM was really a collection of national car companies. So much so that the Opel brand is a German brand. The Vauxhall brand is a England brand. Chevrolet, America. Isuzu, Japan. Whereas Toyota became a worldwide global brand, recognized everywhere. And part of GM's problem is they had so many brands, they didn't have enough advertising money to keep those brand names in the public mind. The Chevette was the best-selling car in 79 and 80, an American small car based on German car technology. German car technology is great. It's designed for a car that goes 160 kilometers an hour on an autobahn. It's rather heavy and powerful for a small car. The Japanese come from a different background. As you know, the speed here on the roads is maybe 60 kilometers an hour, and you can have a lighter weight, more economical vehicle. So making cars is a compromise. Do you go in this direction, or do you go in that direction? The Japanese kind of found the right balance. A lot of these alliance partners just made niche vehicles. The Isuzu Love compact truck there is shown. It was made in Brazil as well as Japan. This is the Chevy product. It was also made in Brazil based on the Opel Kadett. So there were energy crises, major technology changes. Here we are. GM peaked in 1965. They had 50% of the US market. It made $1 billion in profits. $12 billion in today's money. Any of you guys have any idea what the projected profit is for Toyota next year? Any guesses? How much? What is the profit that Toyota will make? I think they will report out April 2015, and this is based on an assumption that there might be a 10% decrease in the average value of the yen. What kind of profit?
I'm just going to guess, the revenue is about, it's over 200 billion now, it's 220, 250, I don't know.
Okay.
Probably 12, around 12.
Okay, in last year it was 12 billion.
Okay.
They're projecting a profit of 25 billion.
Wow, that's
Yeah.
10%.
Yeah, good.
That's awesome.
So,
That's an after tax.
right,
That's awesome.
huge amount of money. GM finally made a profit last year, and they had a profit of 3.8 billion or thereabouts.
Which is respectable.
In recent times for American automakers, but the gap is so wide. What can GM do with this kind of a small profit versus Toyota's profit? So part of the reason GM failed, of course, is they're not loved by the American government or the American people. Toyota is loved by the Japanese government. Let's face it, Abe is really promoting export business by decreasing the value of the yen, and then all of us have to pay more for oil and our goods every day and higher taxes, but that really helps Toyota. And Toyota is dominates the world. They'll be number one, no doubt. So after the oil crisis, 73, Toyota and Nissan developed the highest fuel economy cars, and they just took on the world. Their products had cost, quality, and economy advantages. They started to have economies of scale. GM was going in the other direction. It used to have economies of scale, and then it didn't. GM's multitude of small products were less profitable. Product and production gaps continued to widen. So, of course, in Japan, we talk about the innovative production system. It's captured in books like this, Kaizen, Continuous Improvement. This was written by John Shook. John Shook was a high-level Toyota. He was the highest level American in Toyota for 20 years. And he was the guy who helped Toyota export their culture. Just as Toyota was expanding factories overseas, he was there in Toyota City, and he helped them take their Japanese know-how and convert it into English, and then make it into a teachable product. So now he's a professor at the University of Michigan. And you can find this book in many bookstores in Japan. It's bilingual. It's both in Japanese and English, and it's very graphic. So you can understand the important principles of lean production. In very short terms, GM was fat, way overweight, and Toyota was very lean and a fast runner, very athletic. So the other thing, because Toyota is lean, they can come up with a product concept and quickly put it in market. Maybe in 1/4 of the time that GM could, and at less cost. So their products are fresh and very desirable. Whereas, and then their factories are all new and very productive. 2010, rental cars bought 42% of the cars from General Motors. General Motors, for years, when I was at General Motors, I was forced to buy a new car every 2 years. And it depreciated very fast, especially the small ones, because my used Chevrolet was competing with the used rental car Chevrolet. So the one thing that's important if you buy a car is to have residual value. So when you trade in your used car, the difference between the new car and your used car is very little. Then you can change often, but the gap was huge with General Motors cars. Low residuals equals high monthly lease payments. If you don't buy a car, you lease it. I once bought a Saab, or I drove it as a company car, and I was intending to buy it and then resell it. But suddenly, they had a special for $400 a month to lease a Saab. Then, before I miled out the car and was ready to buy it, they increased that to $800 a month. So, leasing a Saab was like owning a house. $800 a month was like a mortgage payment. Nobody would buy a Saab or lease a Saab at $800 a month. So I said, forget it. You can have your Saab back. I don't want it. And Saab was one case of really poor residual values. People who bought Saabs own them until they die. Whereas Lexus here held 46% of its residual value. You could take a used Lexus and trade it in for a new one. You wouldn't get too much sticker shock. Didn't master making small cars. When you make small cars, you have to be very frugal. And as you know, Japanese are very frugal, especially coming from their background, a less affluent society. They were able to create flexible cells and do things with small lot inventories. This was one product I introduced to Europe. You can find it in Homac. It's these plastic coated pipes and brackets. You can make bookcases and all kinds of things. They use these in electronic factories, car factories in Japan. You can create a special work cell. And then if the product volumes or the type of product changes, you can disassemble it and reassemble it, reuse it. It's recyclable. And I introduced this system to Europe, but it had been going for years in Japan. These are front bumpers. Suppliers would bring the bumpers just in time, minimizing the walking distance and waste of the workers. This was the NUMI plant in California. They introduced this type of system. And it was kind of summarized in this book, The Machine That Changed the World. The productivity was so much better. I'll get into some statistics here in a minute. Okay, yeah, this is it. GM's innovative Japan-inspired leaders closed gaps on the fringes. So this is maybe another reason GM failed, is they didn't really recognize the urgency of change, so they took young leaders who had experienced the Japanese lean way and gave them sideline jobs. For example, Paul Lasorda, he was a leader of the Canada-Suzuki joint venture. So over a period of 5 years, he learned about the Suzuki way of producing low-cost vehicles, and they put him in a former East German factory. And this East German factory was the least productive facility in the world. Of course, when the East German border went down, Opel took it over, and they went from 10,000 workers to 1,000 workers, and the 1,000 Opel workers produced 10 times more cars than the East Germans did. Most of the workers in this factory were from Vietnam, Cambodia, any Soviet ally. So these are examples of the East German car. The Wartburg, made in Eisenach. It was a steel body, and it had a Volkswagen engine in it, imported Volkswagen engine. The other main East German car was the Trabant. It was a plastic car, and it had like a lawnmower engine in it, very smoky exhaust. So a lot of these were trashed when the border came down. And of course, this factory, I went into Eisenach. My first look at Eisenach was, other than the main street, there was no pavement. All the other streets looked like a riverbank. And none of the buildings had been painted in 50 years. And all along the streets, families had taken out all their plumbing, their toilets, their bathtubs, and they were replumbing with West German products and updating. The only hotel in town at that time was owned by some Italians, a little bar and very, very small rooms, and we had to share the toilets. So it was like the Wild West in East Germany as we, but Opel got a really good reputation with the East Germans as being a loyal German company trying to revise and redevelop the East. The other low efficiency small company was Saab, and Bob Lutz, he was perplexed. Why did we buy Saab? It was a losing company. I went to Saab with the invitation of the Treasury Department to look at their production system, and it took them 40 to 50 hours to produce one vehicle. Basically, the Saab 900 was like a Corolla. Corolla could do the same car with 17 to 18 labor hours per car. So we're talking about the labor hours required to press the metal, weld it together, paint it, and put the objects into the car. So each Corolla has about 17 labor hours in the car. The Saab had 50 labor hours, and Saab were trying to say that it's like a BMW. You have to pay a premium price for a Corolla. It didn't go very well in the marketplace. Anyways, I went in and I critiqued their plans, and the GM finance guy said, throw them away. And I said, well, why don't you give these guys a plane ticket to Kami in Canada so they can actually see a lean production facility, and then they can come back and make a new plan. So they did that. And their new 900 was, I think it came out to about 28 labor hours for the lean style vehicle. So here we are again, we're talking about labor hours. Here, has anybody seen the movie Roger and Me? Okay, that was done by Moore, and it was basically based on the arrogance of General Motors. So here he is interviewing the leader of General Motors, and there's nobody in the chair. This book was very interesting, Call Me Roger. Roger gave many speeches, so his speechwriter was with him all the time. But his speechwriter recognized that he couldn't remember his name. So his speechwriter's name was Albert Lee. So this book should have been Call Me Albert, because Roger could never remember his name. Yet he was with him all the time and writing his speeches. So this is kind of the inside story by his speechwriter. What's wrong with GM? It's a bit in another, the leader is in another space. He's really out of touch with even his closest employees. So here was General Motors in America, average hours of vehicle assembly, 41 labor hours in this slide anyways, and average hours of vehicle assembly, 18 at Toyota. 130 defects per 100 cars, 45 defects per 100 cars. The space, so double this factory space. Of course, that means double the investment. 2 weeks apart inventories versus 2 hours. So management of assets, people, factories, suppliers, all messed up in GM. And Roger Smith used to talk about the frozen middle. He would give a speech to the middle managers of General Motors and nothing would happen. So he said the middle of General Motors doesn't understand what I'm saying. They're frozen, they're not moving. He was very frustrated too. When I returned to Canada, Jack Smith was the leader of General Motors worldwide. He had been the leader of GM Canada. Again, he was a finance guy, a bean counter, as well, mentions. And I later learned what bean counters do is bean counters work 24/7. To become a leader of the bean counters, you start as a bagman. A bagman means you carry the presentation of the older guy around, and then you flip the slides on the screen. So this is how the finance department worked. And in New York, they would have war rooms with all the numbers on the walls. So they would work kind of in abstract. They're not working in the real world. They're working in a kind of an artificial world. If you can imagine, you've probably seen war scenes of Hitler in the war room, right? So they're moving the battleships and everything around on a table, but it's not the real world. And he became a renowned bean counter because he knew how to do an Excel spreadsheet. He was one of the first guys to bring a computer to the bean counters. And that amazed some of the older guys. They said, we want this bagman because he has a computer and he can quickly rejig our presentations. So these bean counters would typically almost divorce their families and work 24/7 in New York City in isolation. And less prominent bean counters would become product planners. Product planners would have statistics about all the products and customer needs, and they would also work in boardrooms. So GM was dominated by product planners and bean counters, all working in isolation in war rooms and rejigging the numbers. So as a bean counter saw, all of GM parts divisions are no longer profitable. Let's sell them. So as you know, a business is like a money-making machine if it's run properly. So when you sell your money-making machines, you no longer have a chance to make money. So Magna is one of the biggest buyers of Ford, Chrysler, and General Motors parts divisions, and they became hugely profitable. It's owned by an Austrian man who became an immigrant to Canada. He was a die maker, and most automotive parts have some metal in them. So he saw ways of consolidating. For example, the van seats in Chrysler, Ford, and General Motors are all the same. The metal parts are all made by Magna. So he got economies of scale. Plus he knew how to make metal parts very fast and effectively in Canadian factories with, of course, no union. So I here's the car seats here. Outside, the covers may be different for the different manufacturers, but inside they're all the same. So as we went to modular assembly and outsourcing, Magna picked up the profits of General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler. And as far as the bean counters were concerned, one less headache to deal with. We just got rid of those businesses. In fact, GM's parts making division, Delphi, had 190,000 employees. That was created into a separate company, and stocks were issued on the stock market, and 190,000 GM employees were essentially eliminated. And so Delphi moved most of their production to northern Mexico. Have you guys heard of maquiladora? Maquiladora is the Mexican workers working for $2 an hour versus the $20 an hour in Michigan. And that's where Delphi went. And finally they filed for bankruptcy. And this relates to our next story. Finally, computers come on stream. Well, computers and control of suppliers is something Jack Smith can relate to. This is the era, and here's his new leader of purchasing. This man's name was Iñaki Lopez. He was from the Spanish division. He was an industrial engineer. Using computers and all the data, he could come up with the costs of every part on General Motors, and he would go out for auctions. He had auctions. Do you want to produce this little bit of the car? What is your price? And somebody would say, oh, half the GM price. Okay, you get the job. But he wouldn't qualify if they're any good or not. And this is the picture from Modern Times. Here's Charlie Chaplin. In the movie Modern Times, the factory boss is yelling at Charlie Chaplin, get out, get to the job, go faster, go faster. So using computers, GM could essentially yell at the world, to the world of suppliers, go faster, do it cheaper. And Iñaki Lopez was a very unpopular guy. Hence I got this picture of him holding his head. He was so unpopular when he came to America that I guess he worried about his family and his life, so he picked up a job at Volkswagen. And when he got to Volkswagen, he took, did I mention that? He took box loads of cost data from General Motors to Volkswagen, and there was a huge court case between the two companies. He also took details about the future products. So here we have just-in-time delivery. Just-in-time delivery is possible because of barcode reading and computers. Soon you can have a whole global network, and this is all the advent of the computer. GM initially kind of abuses this system, whereas Toyota are truly in partnership with their suppliers. And when Toyota asked for a big cost reduction, they would validate that it was realistic, and the customer would still receive a quality part. They wouldn't just, from the top, like God speaking to the world, hey, reduce your prices, and I don't care what happens. That was the GM approach. Toyota approach is reduce your prices, but if 20% is not realistic, prove it, and show us why. So there was more of a dialogue between Toyota and their suppliers. So finance department leaders are not entrepreneurs, but planners with slide presentations. This was the comment made when the government took over General Motors. The new leader who was sent in from the US government, he said, all these leaders do at General Motors is make slide presentations and give them. And that's not entrepreneurial type of activity. Bad management, finance staff, bean counter, elite, approved of projects that created excess capacity and higher fixed costs. They weren't very good accountants. They just were good at playing with numbers. Ineffective response to the competition. Leaders lost interest in Saturn division and it failed. Joint ventures with the Asian makers started by product planners became orphans. GM joint venture with Fiat. They had to pay $2 billion to get in it, and then they had to pay another $2 billion to get out of it. The most important point here is every time there was a leadership switch at General Motors, there was a whole set of new plans. And of course, the old leaders' plans had to be thrown away. So Roger Smith was the guy that made Saturn, the small car solution. A complete separate company with different thinking. That was pretty successful, but the following leaders didn't give it any more money to make new products, so eventually it died. And this was very typical of GM, to start something and never finish it. So here we have the NUMMI joint venture lasted 25 years, Saturn 20 years, Hummer lasted 12 years, and Toyota Prius is already 16 years and 4 generations. General Motors' response to the hybrid car is the Chevy Volt. It's first generation. It's probably 10 years too late. GM had an advanced electric program in California. They helped develop the batteries for the Prius. The battery technology used in the nickel hydrate battery of Prius came from General Motors research. GM sold the patents. They gave it up. They told the electric engineers, take a vacation, go away. 10 years later, they say, come back. Well, the party's already gone on. So here it is. These were the quick fixers. Again, here's Roger Smith, he liked these mega projects. So GM didn't have computers, so he bought a computer service company. The computer service company was called EDS from Texas. The leader was Ross Perot. Ross Perot versus General Motors. Ross came in, here they issued stocks called Electronic Data Systems Corporation, General Motors. Perot Electronic Data Systems. He put laptops on all of our desks and connected them all together and made networks. And he said, GM moves too slow, they're out of date, they're crazy. And he started making all kinds of trouble at the board of directors meetings. And so this guy gave him $700 million to disappear. You're no longer an employee, I don't want to hear your stories. Then another big fixer was the Spaniard who cut $1.1 billion from GM's annual purchasing bill, but it was all on paper. Lopez came to Isuzu, he saw the cost-cutting presentations that Isuzu had that were based on Toyota's ideas. Isuzu would go to a supplier and say, we need double-digit cost reduction, 15, 20%. And then they would have workshops together and scope it all out. The supplier would give those savings back to Isuzu once they made the changes. They were real tangible yen or dollars, so to speak. Lopez, he would typically go in and say, okay, 20% savings, we look at the supplier factory. On paper, we could save this, we could move these machines around and do this, cut these workers. And I want the savings right now before anything is changed. It's all on paper. So that bankrupted some suppliers because it cost money to change things, to cut people, to sever their pay, what have you. So he was all a paper man. And Europe, how are we doing on time? Hello, come in. Europe was a pretty corrupted system. A lot of Opel purchasing people were getting money personally from suppliers. So Opel's component costs were higher than their competitors because of a corrupt system. He went into a corrupt system and cut the graft and corruption out of the system. So he looked like a hero. America was less corrupt. So it wasn't as easy to change America as it was Europe. Lopez and 3 purchasing executives left General Motors stealing some 70 cartons of confidential documents. He brought a whole load of Spanish guys to work with him, and they all left and went to Volkswagen, and that created quite a crisis. Too big to fail. Yeah, go ahead, please sit down here. Bob Lutz, as I mentioned earlier, was brought out of retirement. And Bob Lutz is like a super celebrity almost. Celebrity personality. He's worked for every auto company. He even owns jet trainers. He has an Austrian trainer and an American trainer. He flies jets. He's a former Marine. He writes books. He's written 3 books. Here he is with Elon Musk, the leader of Telsa. He was featured in the this is a movie of 3 years ago, The Revenge of the Electric Car. He was the guy that decided on having the Chevy Volt, the product leader. He didn't like the Hummer, but it was already on the go when he came. He helped introduce Cadillacs. The reason he was brought into General Motors is because General Motors created one of the ugliest vehicles in history, the Pontiac Aztec. And Richard Wagner recognized there's something wrong with the product development system at General Motors. These committees and the compromises create just ugly vehicles that nobody wants. So they had to bring in Lutz. He was born in Switzerland. He's a very European sort of guy. And he says, in one of the videos I saw, he was just talking about the beauty of building a car. And he just mentioned the headlight. And the fits and finish, he says, you have to make a headlight like a jewel. It has to be very smooth surfaces and very beautiful. And typically at that time, General Motors had all kinds of part numbers and indentations all over their plastic headlights. And the headlights didn't look appealing at all, and the gaps and the flushness of the metal panels as they came together was very irregular. The paint was not glossy. And Bob Lutz said, you know, a Chevy Malibu basically costs the same amount of money to make as a BMW. But the BMW has some appeal, so people pay more for it. So that was, in a nutshell, his contribution to General Motors. He also came up with the new Camaro program. So a celebrity status guy comes into General Motors and critiques the organization and tries to move it forward. The vision at General Motors was always short term. Every 3 months, the profits on the stock market. Here's Toyota vision of 20 years, global vision. Toyota created an improvement culture, engaging and energizing people to continuously solve problems. It's almost like Toyota University. People want to be there. General Motors was hide the problems. Anybody who admits the problem is not up to management. The vision with harmony with the customer needs and economic trends. So here's continuous improvement, respect for the people, respect for the suppliers, working together. And if you go onto YouTube and look at some of the Toyota video, especially from France and Europe, you can see the enthusiasm of European suppliers to supply and improve Toyota products. As I mentioned in passing, I was in England, and England was kind of a beachhead for Japanese cars. Vauxhall versus Nissan, the national brand of General Motors versus the global brand of Datsun. Now it's changed to Nissan. The German cloned Opel cut costs and improved quality in England, but customers wanted better fuel economy. And GM had not gone global on selling and supplying cars. Making cars globally involved new common designs and global supply networks. So here's one innovation from Japan. A cargo ship. In that era, a cargo ship of cars would carry about 3,000 vehicles. Now they're up to 6,000 vehicles. So the cost of shipping a vehicle from anywhere in the world was rapidly decreased with the help of major Japanese shipping lines and specially designed boats. So I put here Blitzkrieg. Datsun sold almost 7,000 cars here in 1971 in the UK. By 73, a couple of years later, it's 60,000. 10 times more cars. In 1976, it held 6% of the UK market based on a car like this. Rapid expansion, the Blitzkrieg of the whole world. And markets like Ireland that were totally open, 70% Japanese vehicles overnight, Norway. So all around Europe, less protected national markets were all falling towards the Japanese. And the customers wanted better value, reliability, the whole works. 1992 to 96, I was in Vauxhall. Vauxhall's factory was just outside of London, near the Luton Airport. That factory is about 7 stories high. It's a very old-fashioned style of production, very inefficient. It's in the middle of a neighborhood. If you can imagine 1,000 trucks a day plummeting through your residential neighborhood to deliver parts, crazy. But the finance department gave them money for a new car. And we went from 0 robots to 417 robots. Finance staff approved a project that created excesses. Well, the English people said, oh, this is a chance to prolong our careers and life and secure a way of living. So let's go for it. Let's use as much money as we can. So they decided to build 60 cars an hour in this factory, or put in capacity for 60, but they English market only required 30 cars an hour. So you're doing things in excess. Of course the car price increases. Where did I say? Car price increased. The old model versus the new model, it was the Vectra, a kind of 2-liter sedan. And when it came out, BBC Top Gear automotive program. Here's Jeremy. These fellas are on TV every week. And when they looked at the new Vauxhall car, they said, this looks like a stale donut. It's very boring. Who wants to buy it? It was a major hit. You know, we didn't get any endorsement of our product or our brand after building the car. So the factory was closed 2 years later. A huge waste of money. GM should have used that money to modernize something else, or you just close the factory. We didn't need the extra capacity, and it was just a huge negative return on investment. So, too big to fail, changes lag. GM copied the Toyota production system, but they cherry-picked it. Things they liked, they picked and used. Things they didn't like, didn't use it. Leaders talked about a new corporate culture, but it wasn't real Toyota teamwork. It was the American style. Richard Wagner, a graduate of Duke University, famous for basketball. He was a very tall guy too. Basketball star, you give them millions of dollars, the rest of the people get nothing, right? That was General Motors. Here's the Toyota system. It's more like a volleyball team where everybody participates. So here I said all-star leaders versus worker bees, reserved for the big shot. That was GM. Right from my inception at General Motors, I was said, you're not a high pot, high potential person. You were already earmarked, different classes of people. So if you know right from the start you're not high potential, well, why get involved? I don't think Toyota does that. Everybody has potential. Everybody can participate in the Toyota problem-solving system. Everybody can go to university, so to speak. So the important point here was solving problems by huge expenditures was GM approach. If you want a recognition at Toyota, solve a problem, a big problem, using next to nothing, using creativity and your brain power. Then you rose up in the Toyota system. You got your black belt. So. Small cars weren't profitable. Saturn experiment used partners. Small car technology, Suzuki, Toyota, Isuzu, Subaru, Opel. GM had everything. All kinds of know-how, but they couldn't pull it all together. Here's NUMMI, it was closed, saved NUMMI jobs. Saved jobs in Germany. Factories closing, Saturn closing. Failed to establish a new culture. Stopping to fix problems. Bringing problems to the surface, applying continuous improvement. This is the latest GM problem, the ignition system. Have any of you guys heard about the GM small car ignition problem? This is the leader of GM talking to the US government officials in Washington. In some cases, the car shuts off while you're driving and the airbags shut down. And people have crashed into things and airbags have not deployed. And they found out that Delphi, GM's internal parts division, was aware of the problem but had some cover-ups. One problem is sometimes people put too many things on their keychain. But I'm driving a Nissan and I have a push button to start my car, this type of thing. So why do they use this old-fashioned technology? It's not required. So problem solving and product innovation is still an issue at General Motors. Too big to fail, failure to get better. When you look at the Toyota system, it goes down to small cells, small groups of people. Here's their target, production target, actual accomplishment, the balance. So when there's a problem like this, it's recognizable to the small group, so they have to check on the problem, act, plan, do. They go in a cycle of continuous improvement. And find a problem, fix the problem, prevent the problem. Look at the waste. Muri. Standardize work, do the best, the work the best way. One book I didn't spend much time on, and you might find this hilarious and interesting, is called Rivethead. It was written by Ben Hamper, and Michael Moore helped get this book published. It's about his life story of working in a General Motors truck factory. Basically, in a General Motors factory, there were 2 workers for every job. When he worked in the Flint truck factory, he worked 4 hours out of an 8-hour shift. His partner was a pig farmer. The pig farmer farmed in the morning, came to work, and slept in a cardboard box until noon. And then they switched, and he went home and got drunk. So there was no management of GM factories. It was managed by the inmates, so to speak. And his writing style is very hilarious, just talking about the whole fiasco of General Motors. Which is very different than, I didn't bring that book, but another book written by, his name is Pascal. He wrote about his experience at Toyota Canada and how he fell in love with the Japanese system. And now he's a consultant preaching it. Very different than Rivethead. So here again, no breakthrough cars. Electrics were experimentals or PR efforts. This is the picture of the EV1, the electric car that GM had in California. And who killed the electric car in that film? Basically, they're saying GM built an electric car along with other automakers in California because there was a law, 0 emissions. But they did it to prove to the state of California it was impractical to do. So this kind of negative, innovative, non-innovative thinking. The electric and gas-powered sources, the 2014 Volt is an electric car with 380-mile range. So in the updated movie, The Revenge of the Electric Car, they talk about how GM came back into the game. And part of the reason GM came back into the electric game is Telsa. Here's a Telsa battery pack. Panasonic in Japan makes a battery pack. It's basically 2,000 laptop batteries in the bottom of the car. Telsa has a good range, and here's their car. So Telsa is I don't know, it's doing phenomenally in terms of the stock. If you had bought Telsa stock a year ago, that was $50 a share. Now it's $250 a share. The fellow that started Telsa he used to own PayPal. So he used his billions of dollars to start a car company. The idea of using Silicon Valley innovation, computerized thinking, and mix it with car thinking. So we're seeing a revival of innovation. GM may be coming on its way, I don't know. GM didn't master the cost cutting. Making small cars at a profit requires innovative, smooth ways to eliminate constraints. There's a book by Eli Goldratt, a Jewish fella it's called The Goal. Eli Goldratt wrote a book called The Goal, and the need to focus on the constraint of production and eliminate the constraints. So if you can imagine water flowing in a small river, this constraint is like a big rock. If you eliminate this rock, the water flows more smoothly and profits come out. More and more profits you get. So here we've gone. The customer wanted this many, a product every 52 seconds. Now the customer wants the product at twice the rate. So you've got to figure out how to eliminate this bottleneck, this rock in the river. This is actual data based on a Calsonic factory in California. Calsonic came to General Motors and said, we can make air conditioning parts for you for 25% less money. And the GM said, okay, we take the 25% less costly parts. And they undercut. They were doing it initially at a loss, but they went into their factory and eliminated the waste so they could have profits on that part. And that's typically how Japanese get business. Go in with a low ball figure and then figure out how to get a margin on that. So a typical Japanese production system has the count boards, small containers, and here we are in the Homeland style racking system that you can change and readjust. The inventories are nice plastic returnable containers. As Rivethead mentions, the typical container in GM was about this big, almost enough to sleep in. So, and the workers were hiding behind all these containers of parts. Whereas in a GM system or a Toyota system, you can see the worker and what they do all the time. And here's the improvement systems that Toyota uses were very simple. This is an aerial view of the little cell and the walking pattern of the worker. And then they do the steps. So localized management cell system. The cell leaders focus on ways to reach targets with less failure and effort. Engaging the majority using daily targets. Every master begins with a disaster. So that was the typical Toyota system. You're a new employee, okay, you're going to be the disaster, but we're going to give you some opportunities to challenge yourself. And then maybe later you're going to become a master in lean production. So if we do a kind of a biological metaphor, most of you can tie your shoelaces, right? And when you tie your shoelaces, you don't think about it because you have intelligence in your hands. In our bodies, we have distributed intelligence. So the Toyota system is like our bodies, distributed intelligence. The GM system was all the intelligence is in one guy's head. He distributes the directions only. And if we had to rely on that kind of system in our bodies, we would die in sleep, right? Because when we sleep, our distributed intelligence in our body keeps us going. We don't have to think about our bodies all the time. So here we are getting the right combination of low-tech and low-cost, higher advanced cost technology tools all together. Good financial management, everybody focused on projects that cut costs. Effective, fast ways to respond. Engaging vision, everybody's engaged. Elite guide, everyone actively participates. Toyota has an improvement group in different regions of the world. Some people have a knack of being able to improve things. And they are given almost like a karate belts. And the black belts of improvement at Toyota go into these special groups. And they are dispatched to Toyota factories and their suppliers to continuously work on improvements. So why did it fail? Bad financial management. I think we're getting really short on time, right?
Yeah, about 5 minutes.
Okay, mediocre cars, ineffective response to competition, no guiding or engaging vision, didn't master making cars. GM made very profitable trucks and SUVs using kind of old-fashioned technology, but they never mastered making small cars. I invest in the stock market, so I'm always looking at things, and recently the US government sold their General Motors shares, and a hedge fund in Texas, Kyle Bass, bought 8 million GM shares. He's losing money big time now, but he said GM has potential. But I'm a little worried when I look market share. Here's a key product in the American market. It's a Chevy Malibu. It's called the D segment. Honda Accord, Toyota Camry dominate the D segment. So here's a Toyota. For every 2 Toyotas sold, there's 1 Chevy Malibu. GM is not a leader in a key segment of the market. That to me is a problem if I'm going to buy their stock. So, and I mentioned earlier the vast difference between the profit of Toyota and GM. How can GM maintain itself if it doesn't have profits on the level of Toyota? So too big to fail, that was picked up in the press too. Here's the the failure time after the subprime mortgage crisis. Here's the former leader of GM. It became government motors. Use your money to make cars less safe and more expensive. So people are still criticizing whether or not this whole thing is a good idea. Wrapping it up on the last slide here. In the course of preparing this presentation, I was surprised when I looked at the statistics in GM Canada, my home country. GM went from 22% of the market in 2008 during the Lehman shock to only 12%. Why? The American government said you have to cut out brands. And one brand that they cut out was Pontiac. It was a major seller in Canada. GM announced that one of the two Oshawa assembly plants scheduled to close in 2015 will stay open. That's the Camaro plant. The schedule is to close all manufacturing in Canada. In the last 16 years, Honda Civic was the best-selling car in Canada. So who knows, maybe GM will go down again. That's my presentation. Hopefully you've got some questions. Thank you.